After everything you have seen and lived through and learned, do you believe that some version of communism is still a defensible idea?
Абсолютно верно.
Well, I would say so, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Daniel Kitts of tvu.org. On August the 13th, The Agenda is re-airing a 2005 interview with former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. I helped produce that interview and considered one of the highlights of my career, and I'm with two other people who I assume also consider it one of the highlights of their career. Steve Paikin, who did the interview, and Dan Dunsky, the then executive producer of Diplomatic Immunity, and also a former executive producer of The Agenda. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Daniel, good to see you.
Hi, everybody.
See both of you too. Let me just start off by, this guy, for all of us, was a giant of history. We all, we all remember the Cold War and remember Perestroika and his tenure of the Soviet Union. Steve, let me start with you. What did you think when you first saw him?
Well, that's the thing. You walk in the room and there standing in front of you is a man who changed the course of history. And I don't know about anybody watching this, and I don't know about you two guys, but it is not a frequent occurrence when you walk into a room and you are standing 6 inches away from somebody who absolutely changed the course of the history of the entire world.
When the Prime Minister of China, Zhou Enlai, was still alive, he talked to a French delegation, and the French asked him, "Mr. Prime Minister, what do you think? What is your evaluation of the impact of the French Revolution on the world and on China?" And that was about 180 years after the French Revolution, and he said, "Well, it's too soon to tell." And Perestroika, well, I must say it was perhaps even a bigger project.
So that's a pretty heavy thing. And I don't mind telling you, you do a double take, you are nervous, you can't help but be impressed at what this man was able to accomplish. And then you very quickly try to put that in your back pocket and focus on the task at hand.
What about you, Dunn?
Everything that Steve just said, but the paradox for me, and you started off, Daniel, by saying he was a giant of history. And I think I expected him to be taller, and he wasn't. I'm not a particularly tall guy, and he was a little bit shorter than me.
What do you remember most about meeting him and the interview? I'll start again with you, Steve.
I remember asking a friend of mine who was born in the Soviet Union, give me a couple of things I can say in Russian, just to kind of establish something. Because obviously he didn't speak any English, I didn't speak any Russian. And the most difficult thing about doing an interview under those circumstances is trying to create any sense of bond or connection or chemistry with somebody that you don't speak the same language as. I can also tell you that the Russians who are here in Toronto, some of them are very good hockey players. But that's another story.
Well, that's an old story and a good story. Canadians and Russians can't play hockey, sure.
So I knew that was going to be a problem, and I thought if I can drop a couple of words, a couple of sentences in Russian to get things started, that might make him feel a little more comfortable. So I said to him, "Здравствуйте," which basically is Russian for, nice to meet you, how you doing, that kind of thing. And I remember this, he stuck out his hand, we shook hands, he didn't really look at me. He sort of looked off in the distance and he went, "Привет," which is just hi in Russian. So we had that established off the top. And I guess I remember thinking, well, my big attempt to speak a little bit of Russian to get him more comfortable fell flat on its face, because he didn't even look me in the eye and we really didn't establish any kind of contact. And I just thought, okay, that didn't work. Focus, try something else. So we then sat down and off to the races we went.
It's interesting that you say that, Steve, because what stood out for me in part was how formal he was in his responses. Now, I haven't seen the video. I'm looking forward to seeing it when it gets re-aired. I haven't seen it in almost 20 years, but he had this demeanor that was quite formal and, well, formal. And your interview, I mean, we've done many interviews with perhaps not people of the same stature of Gorbachev, but I know your interview style, and I know how we liked to do interviews for these kinds of programs. And I remember thinking, as the interview was going on, how is this going? I mean, you know, is this a little too formal? Is it a little too stiff? Is the audience going to react to that? And I put that out of my mind, of course, because just given who he was and what it was that we were talking about. So it's interesting that you point that out.
You know, in 2005, he'd been out of power for a long time, but he still seemed like a real giant of history. And I'm not saying he isn't anymore, but his legacy seems to be very much diminished, I would say, you know, in the 15 years since we spoke to him, or 16 years, I guess, since we spoke to him, because, you know, I mean, today Russia is a corrupt police state run by a former KGB agent who's constantly scheming against the United States and the West. Authoritarianism seems to be on the rise in many parts of the world. And, you know, that seems very far from the vision that Gorbachev had of a democratic Russia, or the former Soviet Union being democratic and basically having a good relationship with its former foes in the West.
And a lot of good things are being said toward Russia in Western Europe. 55% of Russia's trade is with Western Europe, so tremendous resources are being exchanged. And so it would seem that we are the closest of friends. We're all Europeans, but I do have the impression that it's all fine, let Russia move forward, but slowly, not too fast. Let Russia be bogged down in Chechnya and some other place, and let that continue for some time.
I wonder what you two think about that. Let's start with you, Don.
It's remarkable how in such a short period of time, there is a kind of a historical, it's more than amnesia. I wonder how many younger people today would even recognize the name Mikhail Gorbachev. And as we said a little bit earlier, he was a giant of the second half of the 20th century, and obviously somebody who had a major hand in ending the Cold War, which was a defining part of all of our childhoods and our early adulthood. And it's remarkable to me that he is a bit of a forgotten man.
I would just piggyback on that by saying that if there's anybody watching this who is, say, under the age of 45 years old, they may not truly appreciate what a potentially glorious moment that was back in the early 1990s, when we thought the Soviet empire, the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan had called it, was actually going to come to an end, something that was completely unimaginable. It was unimaginable 6 months before it happened. And yet there it was happening. And Gorbachev was the guy who did it. And I also remember at the time, President George Bush, the father, because he was the president at the time, saying, you know, we're not going to be having ticker tape parades down, Broadway in New York City to celebrate the fact that the West won the Cold War, because we want to make Gorbachev a partner, and we want a better relationship with the former Soviet Union or its constituent republics now. And therefore, we don't want to humiliate them, which seemed like the right thing to do. And that moment in history seemed so hopeful. You know, and for a moment, Gorbachev gave us an opening where we thought we actually had a chance to be optimistic about a future which did not involve nuclear missiles from the West and the Soviet Union facing each other, and the possibility of imminent annihilation. And unfortunately, it was a brief moment. And, you know, here we are. It's like everything old is new again.
In that moment of optimism, it's important to remember that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was relatively bloodless, and, you know, far less bloody than the collapse of the British Empire, for instance. And we owe, and certainly the former and all the subjects of the former Soviet Empire owe a debt of gratitude to Gorbachev for making that happen.
That's a great point. That is really, really significant. Think of the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people who did not die because of Mikhail Gorbachev. He deserves some recognition for that, to be sure.
Absolutely.
Mr. Gorbachev, it is very good of you to spend so much time with us. Spasiba, spasiba, spasiba.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.